the geography of where Jesus is located. So that influences how he is interacting with people. But Jesus is also an expert communicator, which means that as Jesus is teaching, he ends up pulling from images that are in the landscape or in the cultural waters of the people who are listening to him teach. And I want to point out a few of these. I think they are so much fun. Well, I actually think all the things with the geography are fun, and maybe I've been saying that a lot. But here we go. This is the north end of the Sea of Galilee, and you're looking to the west. So Capernaum would be down here along the shore, hidden, it's out of sight. We have the green grass, and because everything is so green, you should know this is during the rainy season. In fact, I think I took this picture it was a trip that I did in February. So the primary trade route came from these are the horns of Hittim. So they come from the Jezreel Valley. They come down through, actually, let's go back, turn on the pen. Through these cliffs, those are the cliffs of Arbel. They come down and touch the Sea of Galilee, basically, and then come around the perimeter, just like that. So that is the primary road. Right here at the shoreline, we have a town that is called Magdala. Now, this might sound familiar to you. Mary Magdalene she is Mary of Magdala. That's how she gets her name. So Magdala was known as a fishing town. So in discovering the ancient harbors, there's quite a large harbor at Magdala. Now, what is also interesting is when archaeologists were digging, in fact, some of these are fairly new digs at Magdala. It's been really fun to watch a lot of this come to light. This picture right here is of a shop in Magdala, and those squares that you see, one wall of the shop is lined with these squares, and we think they were filled with water and that these are holding basin for fish. We also know that the area of Magdala was known historically, other people make reference to this. Magdala was known for its salting industry. So if we put all these clues together, we have a large harbor off of the Sea of Galilee and a town where the stores in the town were selling fresh fish, but they were also preserving and salting the fish. Like I mentioned, that boy that offered up his food, his lunch to Jesus, and Jesus fed the crowds. That was probably, maybe a small fish like a sardine that had been salted and preserved. And so maybe that fish came out of Magdala. We don't know. But this is interesting because in the picture that I did show you where you're looking at the green hillside, we think this area of the Sermon on the Mount, people put it in different locations. We just need a hillside. But outside of the perimeter of Capernaum, well, if Capernaum is down here, there is a really nice big hill over on this right-hand side of the picture. It is on this hill that we have a long tradition of preserving the memory of the Sermon on the Mount. But it could have been, some people like to put it on top of Mount Arbel or choose one of the hillsides. It almost doesn't matter because no matter which hillside you're on, although we do need to put it in the political region of Galilee, but no matter which hillside you're on, you can see the entire perimeter of the sea. And so it's interesting because in one of the parts of the Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus is teaching the crowds, he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again?" Now, he is teaching people from the political region of Galilee. He is teaching on the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. And although Matthew doesn't tell us, I always imagine Jesus, gesturing towards Magdala. People understood how significant salt was in a very practical way. Now, I've heard many a sermon on salt and like finding the pattern of salt throughout Hebrew scripture, and that is an interesting trail to follow. But there is a very plain geographical reason why Jesus is choosing this particular example. So he continues, it is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Let's go back to this shoreline of the Sea of Galilee, because on the eastern side, so the eastern side, you should be thinking already on in the district of the Decapolis, there is a hill, and I know it's a little hazy in this picture. This is actually, when I took the picture, I thought it was really clear. Our horizon line was really nice, but it shows up a little hazy here. But there is this nice hill. It's quite dramatic when you see it in person. It just is a little bit faded because we have taller hills that are behind it. But it's almost an island of rock. And then it's connected with a spur of rock that is connecting it to these hills that are just on the eastern side of it. This place is where a huge Decapolis city was built. So this is the site of Hippus, sometimes called Susita. So Hippus was a large Decapolis city. So for the Decapolis region, this is the only city that sat right on the shoreline. So if it is a Decapolis city, we know that it was built in the footprint of the Greco-Roman cities, which means extravagant architecture, paved roads. They might have even had lanterns that were down the road, so fire that was lit at night to help illuminate the city. And then look at the geography. It is elevated up off of the water, off of the shoreline. It's elevated and very easy to see. It would have been a dramatic and perpetual example of the power of Rome just sitting on the horizon line of everyone who lived around the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. And so again, let's go back to the Sermon on the Mount, because right after talking about salt, Jesus says this, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." Now pause for a second, because I hear a lot of people interpret this verse and say, well, Jerusalem is a city set on a hill. And I get the theology behind why they want to say that. But I always am going to lean towards the geography. Where is Jesus when he's teaching this? And is there something on his horizon line that he can point to? And sure enough, if you are standing at the shoreline, if you're on one of the hillsides in Galilee, and he has just pointed in the area of Magdala, I imagine him pointing, if he's talking to those people, and say, "You are a city on a hill." Well, of course, everyone is going to glance over to the Decapolis, to the very large city of Hippus that is sitting on a hill that has light that shines out at night. And you know how anytime you look at a city at night, your eyes automatically drawn to it. That light kind of pulls your attention towards it. And so Jesus is saying, you yourselves, you are a light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. So let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. I just think that is really amazing experiential education. It is using something that is a dramatic example. So that might be a pagan city. It might be a Hellenized city on a hill. But just as you can't help but look at it every single night, that is how you should be. Your light should shine that brilliantly. Now, also on the horizon line, we have the city of Tiberias. And I mentioned in a previous lecture how Tiberias was just in the process of being built. So Herod Antipas is building a huge city. He wants to turn it into the capital of the Galilee. But during the lifetime of Jesus, it's only a portion built. Now, this is where we get to hear a little bit of the humor of Jesus, which we don't always attribute humor to him, but I love these examples because Tiberias was fraught with all kinds of building delays. So Herod Antipas was in a hurry to build the city, and he wasn't very careful. He actually chose a place that had been a burial ground, and so Jews, this is the whole political area of the Galilee over here, right? This is the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Jews weren't going to live in Tiberias because why would they live in an unclean place? That is not maintaining the purity laws. So he was having a hard time getting people. He had to force people to move in to live in Tiberias. Herod Antipas also, a couple different times in his building campaigns, ran out of money. In fact, Tiberias was known as a place where Herod Antipas had started to build a large tower and ran out of money before he could complete it. And so when we get to Luke, this, you have to read this like with the humor that I think is intended. Jesus is talking to crowds of people about the cost of discipleship, and he says, "For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" And I imagine all of the crowds of people listening to Jesus like kind of laughing behind their hands over what Jesus said. He doesn't have to say that he's referring to Herod Antipas, but I would wager that the majority of people hear this example and they're like, oh, you mean just like Herod Antipas over there in Tiberias was not able to finish his tower? That's really funny. In a similar way, Jesus says, as he is talking about the cost of discipleship again, he ends up talking about a king going to war. Now, this is also interesting, and this gets into understanding the historical context of who is Herod Antipas. So Herod Antipas had a wife who was a Nabatean princess. And so the Nabateans were the people group who were able to figure out how to traverse the Arabian desert. They ended up gaining a lot of wealth because they were able to provide trade routes where absolutely no one else knew how to do trade. So there is a Nabatean king who is creating peace by, his daughter marries Herod Antipas. So this Nabatean king, it's a political agreement more than a marriage for love. But Herod Antipas falls in love with his brother's wife, and she refuses to marry Herod Antipas until he gets rid of his Nabatean wife. And so Herod divorces his Nabatean wife. She goes home to dad, tells him what Herod has done, and her dad, the Nabatean king, who has been irritated with Herod Antipas for quite a while, this is the final event that makes him want to go to war with Herod Antipas. So Herod Antipas and the Nabatean king face off in battle, but Herod Antipas loses poorly. Okay, so knowing that political event is in the background, let's look at another example Jesus chooses to use about discipleship. Or what kind of king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. And again, I just imagine, right? We have groups of people that Jesus is teaching. He's in the political region of Galilee where Herod Antipas is in charge, and he's making these comments about things that have happened in the time of Herod Antipas, which I just think is hilarious. And again, I think the crowds would have laughed. Now, knowing that in the geography of the North, a lot of people were engaged in agriculture. And we have not only all of the fishing stories, but we have very agrarian stories. So as Jesus is teaching people, he ends up pulling from common images around them, like this one, using the agriculture around him to teach. When a large crowd was coming together and those from various cities were journeying with them, he spoke by way of a parable. The sower went out to sow his seed, and as he sowed, some fell beside the road, and it was trampled underfoot, and the birds of the air ate it up. And I love it because this is imagery that still happens today. I took this picture as I was walking down the road. I was on this path on a hike, and just to my right, there was a huge wheat field. And so, although we are using tractors now to spread the seed in the wheat field, some of the seed got scattered among the thorns that lined the path, and some of the seed ended up on the hard road path, and the birds were there eating it. And I thought, this picture right here that I am seeing is an image that people would have been accustomed to seeing. And so when Jesus is teaching, they can picture immediately in their head what he is talking about. It's relating to their lifestyle. So when he continues, other seed fell on rocky soil, and they would have all understood like how much work it took to clear the soil. And as soon as it grew up, it withered away because it had no moisture. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up with it and choked it. Other seed fell into the good soil, and it grew up and produced a crop 100 times as great. As he said these things, he would call out, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Right? All of these parables are inviting people into the lesson. Remember when we were talking about the educational system and how I was talking about how the children were trained to ask good questions, and they're asking good questions because they are participating in the learning process? The parables are like that. The parables invite the listener in. The person who tells the parable isn't explaining it to them. It's telling a story and then inviting people, participate, think about this. Who are you in this parable? What do these stand for? What other people are involved in this parable? It's a very actively listening kind of exercise.